How's it going, guys, and welcome back to the next installment in the Braille Scale Diorama series. First, I'd recommend you check out the previous video in this series where I talk about composition and design. This video is going to be about how to tell an effective story and some elements that help point the viewer to that storyline, but I'm going to be using some terms from the previous video that if you're not familiar with, might be beneficial just to check that one out first. I went ahead and included the link here to that video, and then it's also down below in the video description. Of course, nothing in that video is really new information. I'm not really making anything up. A lot of what I've learned over the years has come from this book. Shepherd paint is definitely the one that has inspired plenty of people to get into dioramas, and it's interesting kind of rereading the introduction of this book. He talks about how the scale modeling diorama community is relatively new. This was published second edition in I think 1999 and 2000, right around the new millennium, and it was recently evolved from true like shadow box, forced perspective, museum kind of works. And I think his work with Monogram to market their kits with dioramas really helped get a lot of people into the hobby. But in addition to that, there's this armor guide. Chris Morosco has a good book, but I mean, of course, he references Shepherd paint as well, and then just specifically armored dioramas by Len Kessler here, just to name a few. So you want to build a diorama that tells a compelling story to the viewer, right? Where to start? So I would ask the question, what inspired you to build a diorama in the first place? Was it a movie you saw, a book you read, just an interesting reference picture you found on the internet, a unit history? Maybe you've got a family member that served and you want to portray something to kind of honor their service, or the kit makers could do the work for you these days, right? I mean, this is pretty much a diorama in a box. You've got a four-man flat crew here. You've got the flat gun elevated. They're bringing in more ammunition, and you've got the guy in charge with some binoculars calling targets out. Even more so here, you've got different options to customize this diorama yourself. You can have that at a 0-degree angle, where it's essentially aiming at personnel or vehicles or something like that, 20 degrees, 40 degrees, all the way up to 60 degrees. Now obviously the crew that this comes with is going to kind of make it what appears to be that 40-degree angle, but if you're comfortable with modifying figures, which is something that Shepherd paint really had to do a lot of, because back in the 80s, I think when the book originally came out, there really weren't a lot of these kits with figures already set to a story. So a good story is something that's going to capture the viewer's attention and pull them into it, right? So you usually need to have a human element, because that's what the viewer is, a human. You have to have them be able to identify with the humans in that scene so that they immerse themselves in that diorama. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have figures. A scene completely lacking figures that normally should have figures can also help tell that story. Shepherd paint's example, if you're familiar with his book, is of a crashed bomber in the African desert. So you have this huge space with this bomber, but it's completely destroyed. It's been there a long time. It's faded. There's no people around, no bodies, nothing. It's just abandoned in the middle of nowhere in the desert. By the way, at any point in time you got any questions or feedback, please shoot me a comment. Let me know, and I'll do my best to answer any questions, or we can have a discussion about different diorama theory or story concepts, things like that. There's kind of 3 different ways you can tackle telling a specific event, right? You can highlight some of the interesting things that happened before the event, the build up to it, some of the planning, some of maybe the fear during the event itself, which is usually compared to all the work that goes in ahead of time and then all the aftermath. The event itself is relatively small, and it's not I don't want to say it's difficult to portray action in a diorama, but it's frozen in time. So you might have to go above and beyond to really portray a good sense of action. Then again, there's the after. What happens after typically could be, um, either a scene of victory, a scene of defeat, some kind of surrender, or just damaged vehicles, destroyed vehicles, people going through stuff and scavenging off the battlefield. And again, in his book, Shepard Payne talks about how the more interesting events typically occur before and after, and I tend to agree with them. I mean, there's so much kind of over dramatized action that Hollywood kind of throws into war movies and different battle scenes and things like that, but it's even within on a kind of micro level, the actions taken by a group of soldiers getting in place to take the shot or to conduct the ambush or something like that. There's that, like, right before the actual actions happen, and then even then, like, right after the fact, when they're consolidating their wounded, or they're checking to make sure that the enemy really is dead, or that there's no intelligence or anything like that they can find on the bodies. They can strip the weapons away. They can unfortunately loot personal effects, things like that. So there's more that goes on before and after. During is really not as exciting in a counterintuitive kind of way. But again, to really pull that viewer in, you want to be able to convey some emotions too, whether it's fear, excitement, boredom, hunger, cold, heat, something. I mean, some kind of a feeling. You have to do your research, though. It has to be believable. Some of the first dioramas that my brother and I built with my dad involved like a T-55 going across a battlefield to, attack a bunch of American GIs in an M3 half-track with a mortar tube, and some sandbag checkpoint with a World War II Gaz Jeep coming around. So just a whole hodgepodge of obviously Russians and Americans have never really fought in direct combat, which would have shocked an 80s child like myself who grew up on James Bond movies and was sure that World War II was about America versus Russia, but that's a different story. So bad figures can ruin an otherwise good diorama. You do have to get at least passable at figure painting, unfortunately. But in a larger scale, bad research can also ruin what would otherwise be a solidly executed diorama, which I almost did myself. I almost included a Russian wearing a reversible winter jacket, white and oak leaf camo, in what I would have portrayed as a 1941 Operation Barbarossa diorama, and that jacket wouldn't have come out until winter of 1943. So little things like that your larger audience might not notice or might not care about, but the people that are going to be judging the competitions, or the true historians, something like that, they're going to point that out real quick and say, hey, it doesn't make sense. I'm going to go through a couple different box arts, things like that, and show you some potential inspiration and kind of play around with the imagination aspect. Like, let's take something like a simple box art and try to imagine ourselves with these characters, or try to imagine what these characters are thinking, or what's going on. Some of it is pretty straightforward. Some other stuff is maybe a little more of a stretch, but then it's kind of up to you as the modeler to make it happen in the diorama execution. Here's an example from Airborne Miniatures of essentially a diorama in a box. Two Marines helping another wounded Marine, and if you're familiar with the actual event that this portrays, then you know exactly where it was, exactly when it was, who it was, why. I mean, all of it is really right there in the box for you. All you have to do is assemble it and paint it, put in a little, Iraqi wall with a blue metal door or something like that, and you're good to go. Here's really powerful diorama in a box, right? This is probably the best way you can tell the story of late war Germany, Berlin, something like that, where you have what appears to be, young teenagers, maybe even younger than that, participating in the war effort as part of the Volkssturm. Here's an example of some inspiration or some figures that you would need to better portray a specific story surrounding a disabled Russian vehicle. And here's one to do the same thing with an abandoned, destroyed German vehicle. Maybe not as exciting as a bunch of German tankers bailing out of their Panzer, but at the same time, probably just as interesting, because how many people tend to think of the front lines as a place where you can get a good shave and catch up on a good book, right? So this gives a good human element to the calm before the storm, or after a successful day on the battlefield or something like that. Just the average day-to-day necessities that honestly make up probably a majority of the time, assuming that the unit isn't somewhere in an urban center like Stalingrad, or a modern situation like Fallujah. This is a pretty typical scene for a diorama. You've got the officer in charge, some of the local commanders on the ground, a couple of troops just hanging out, and they're battle planning, right? It's a necessity before a large movement. You have to look at your options and make a choice and then act on it. Because it's such a common topic, there's quite a few different variations on that theme. So this is Dragon's version of the commander conference in the Kharkov area. And again, just based on the differences in uniforms, whether it's a cold situation, European situation, North Africa, wherever it is, different uniform hints, things like that. How muddy are they? Like, are they involved in the fighting? Are they strictly command staff? Things like that. And a third example, this is the command staff, and you can tell they're very far removed from the front lines. They have to get the binoculars out. They don't look like they've even seen a little bit of mud. Notice that Volstad, who's really good in terms of inspiring dioramas, hasn't even put any mud on their boots. One thing you will notice with all these is they're all facing in the same direction. All these kits involve the one storyline where all the characters are all facing the same point of action. Here's some Panzer Riders, 1943 or 44, in the winter time frame. And again, that's just more based on their uniforms, based on their weapon systems. But you can tell you've got one guy up front here who maybe he's telling a joke or a story, or he's in command and he's giving them some orders, but all three of them are facing him and look like they really are paying attention to what it is he's going to say. Here's another example from Budapest in 1945. You've got all these late war camouflage patterns and uniform types. You can tell it's cold, they're all bundled up, but they're all facing in that same direction. So the action is definitely to the viewer's left as they sneak around a corner or hide behind cover. Now here's a couple of interesting scenes with some GIs and bazookas. And what I think is really interesting about the two here on the left is the bazooka's already loaded. So this GI hasn't taken a shot yet, and his loader already has the next round ready to go. Now, depending on what you want to show in your storytelling here, this could be an example of a situation where these GIs are up against a heavily armored vehicle, and they know that maybe 2 or 3 hits on this thing might not necessarily disable it, or they might have multiple targets out there and they've got to load them quickly. So either they don't trust that these rounds are actually going to destroy their target, or they have multiple targets. But either way, it immediately tells a story that might be a little open to interpretation, but if you can hone that in and make it more known, you can do that with something, even kind of cheating with the title. If you get a little plaque or something like that for your diorama, and you could title it, for example, 3rd time's the charm, or something like that, to indicate that they've already fired 1 round. They're getting ready to fire their 2nd or 3rd. Maybe they've got a 4th one lined up. Here's some necessities that you don't necessarily get excited about and go rush to the store to buy, but you still will need these if you want to do any kind of diorama that involves either a resupply, some kind of supply vehicle, or that call them behind the front lines, where troops have an opportunity to kind of get more food and supplement their military rations with some much needed real food. I mean, you've got apples, you've got fresh vegetables, stuff like that is definitely worth its weight when you've been eating hardtack and essentially Spam or whatever else. But beyond the inspiration in the actual execution phase, I think there's a way you can kind of check your work, right? Ask yourself the simple question that everyone tries to get across with any story that they tell. It's the W's, right? Who, what, where, when, and the important one, why, and even how. So I'll go through some examples that I've got here, and we can talk about what it depicts, where it depicts it, in what point in time, what location, what units, and then go into that conversation about why is this important to the viewer, or why is this happening? What kind of story can we tell, and how does this matter to the characters? How does this matter to the viewer? What are they doing, and what and why are they doing it? Essentially, if you can answer that why question, for example, with this Panzer IV, you've got a couple casualties, you've got a couple Russians. There's a guy taking a picture. What happened? Okay, it looks like these guys. They're happy, they're smiling, there's some kind of victory or something like that. They're holding these giant rifles. Okay, those are anti-tank rifles. There's a track that got broken loose. Maybe they happened to get a lucky shot and break a track pin or something like that, and they disabled a Panzer IV with a rifle that had a hard time probably disabling a Panzer II. So it kind of answers that question of why they're so excited, why it's worthy of getting a picture taken in the first place, and then it explains why those characters are there, why the tank is disabled, why there's German casualties. And that contrast between the death on the battlefield and the smiling, grinning faces of these Russian anti-tank gunners is kind of that bleak, bizarre form of like a morbid kind of happiness. They're essentially celebrating that they've killed these people and destroyed this vehicle, and it's I think more common than the flip side of that, which would be if these Russians were sober and solemn about it. Oh no, it's so upsetting that we just had to take a life. I don't think that was something that they would think twice about. I think they would be excited and happy in that moment and proud to take that picture and defend their country. So in this example, which is more of a vignette because we really only have the vehicle, we can't answer all these questions of the story involved. We can only really hint at some of it. No figures, and a lot is left to the viewer to imagine. But what we can answer, the who and the what, right? This is German. The vehicle is a 234-2 Puma. Where, again, based on the markings, the camouflage, the hedgerows, this is probably France, Normandy area, something like that. When, again, just based on the setting and the vehicles and the camo pattern and stuff like that, 1944. Summer, based on, again, the amount of greenery, maybe late spring, but either way, we can get a pretty good idea of what's going on. With all the who, what, where, when, we can't really answer the why. We can, again, hint at it, right? Like this Puma is a scout vehicle. Now it's looking like it's almost laid in as an ambush. So maybe this is post D-Day and it's trying to set up a blocking position. But I mean, again, we're at this point we're really relying more on what we know about the history of the vehicle and the actions it might have participated in back in 1944. There's really nothing here other than the position of the gun and the way it's hidden in the hedgerow to suggest a whole lot beyond a reconnaissance operation or some kind of ambush or something like that, but nothing definitive. Now, if we wanted to tell more of a story with this, with a couple figures, it wouldn't be too hard to do. and it would be very easy to quickly change the narrative, right? You throw down a couple German figures with some binoculars, a guy on the radio, people looking over a map, something like that. You can kind of solidify the idea that this is a kind of an active ambush reconnaissance type operation. And again, given the uniforms and things like that, you can further kind of solidify the units involved and what exactly they're up to. On the flip side, you throw in one or two German casualties and then a squad of American GIs, and they're setting in some kind of command position here. All of a sudden, the story has gone from preparations for an ambush or an active reconnaissance mission to all of a sudden now this position's been overran. There are no more Germans in the area, or at least living Germans in the area, and American, and Allied forces have kind of set in a foothold. And both of them can be interesting. It really just depends at that point on what kind of story you as the modeler want to tell. So here's another vignette that's potentially a diorama in progress, right? It just depends on what kind of figures you add, what kind of story you want to tell. It looks like it's, fall, early winter, or something like that. There's no snow, but there's no leaves in the trees, and there's a lot of dead grass and leaf texture, things like that back there. And you can tell it's not necessarily in a safe area, I guess you'd call it, because the brick wall has been knocked down, perhaps due to fighting, or even if it was due to some kind of accident, it hasn't been repaired. So you can tell that it's not really a priority for whoever's living there, or this American scout car crew that's passing through. But you can do a lot of things to this scene with different figures. You can make it into a combat scene where the vehicle is completely abandoned by American troops, and you've got Germans taking cover behind the vehicle and advancing as like a last offensive kind of scene. You can do an American maintenance scene where they're just loading up, local food and vegetables and refueling and putting on thicker jackets as it starts to get colder, just as a way to kind of emphasize the change in seasons and the time frame as 1944 comes to a close and the war comes to a close. As far as the where, we don't really know where, so some things you could do to make the location a little more obvious than just somewhere in Europe in 1944. Or even early 1945. Again, you really don't know, but if you put some road signs on here with some specific names from historical battles, things like that, different directions, even a simple road sign that has an arrow says Berlin, 100 miles or something like that, just as a way to further emphasize the place, the time period, and even provide a motivation for why the crew is excited or why they are, upset or depressed or what's going on. Are they loading up casualties? Are they just kind of hanging out behind the lines? Is this a scout car that's at the front of the lines? There's a lot of different things you can do with a couple little clues and the kind of attitudes of the crew. But the most important thing is the figures on a scene this small really all have to be working together. You can't necessarily have multiple plots going on. You can't have some soldiers fighting and shooting and yelling at each other and other soldiers loading up boxes on the back end. It just wouldn't make sense. The scene's too small. Everything that's happening on a scene this size should be happening completely. It should be happening to everybody. Everyone should be involved in it. Here's a Russian anti-aircraft gun, and the first thing you might notice is that unlike most anti-aircraft guns, this one is not pointed at the air. So you can quickly deduce that it's not necessarily an anti-aircraft gun at the moment, but maybe an anti-personnel, anti-vehicle gun, which for an anti-air crew is probably the last thing that they want to do. Not exactly what they are trained to deal with. And even the high velocity fragmentation rounds, aside from personnel in the open, it's not a really effective round against something like an armored panzer column. Again, add some signs, say something like Stalingrad, 5 kilometers, whatever, something like that. We'll put it in a specific place, and then if you add some German command staff kind of facing the opposite direction of the gun with a little radio operator, and then the scene quickly turns from something of a Soviet last-ditch effort into something more of an advancing German position that has not only overwhelmed local defenses but made it all the way past the main lines to the air defense lines, which are usually not only behind the main lines but kind of centrally located around whatever it is they're trying to defend. So in terms of the rules of composition and design and things like that we were talking about in the previous video, if you wanted to depict this Sherman driving past destroyed, abandoned Panzer IV during the invasion of Normandy, there's different ways you could do it. Sure, you could just have it right like this. The Sherman is just cruising along, the Panzer IV is right there, that's it. And that would probably be fine for a little vignette, but what kind of story are you trying to portray? Do you want to show an example where the commander of the tank is fascinated by this destroyed vehicle? Maybe he's never seen a German tank before this close, and they're driving by, and he tells the driver to slow down so he can take a look at it. Right now, the Sherman and the Panzer are at the same level. It's not very dynamic. So what you could do is you could push this Panzer IV off the side of the road, and as the Sherman's driving by, you can modify the figure of the commander to make him kind of peer up and over to get a good view. Now doing that will highlight the fact that right there you can see an impact from some kind of anti-tank round, and then clearly given the angle, it's not very likely that that's the way the round impacted the Panzer IV. So by pushing off the side of the road like that, you've done essentially the same thing that some engineer unit probably did, and once this vehicle was destroyed, it got removed off the road after the fact to clear a path. So just by doing some simple things like that, in an effort to better tell the story and have the story make a little more sense and be a little more dynamic, you've drawn attention to the damage from the Panzer IV by what the vehicle commander is focusing on. By having that vehicle commander focus on something, the viewer, a human, is going to see that human and say, oh, what's he doing? Oh, he's looking at something. Oh, look, he's looking at this impact. You can also use things like color. Don't make the entire vehicle all rusty and burnt out. Have the vehicle mostly camouflaged like it would be, with a small burned out, rusted section in the back where the engine got destroyed. And it's important not to clutter the scene. It's a small scene already. It's 1/72 scale. So if you threw in a whole line of infantry soldiers walking down the street next to this tank, all of a sudden the viewer might get confused. Is the vehicle commander leaning over to talk to someone down there to tell them, hey, this is the plan, don't, go around the next bend until we get up there so we can clear the path for you, or vice versa, hey, don't, we're not going anywhere until you go up there and you make sure there's not an anti-tank team around the corner, which is actually a more likely story, at least with the lessons learned in modern armored combat. So when it comes to creating a little bit of a additional dynamic layer, you can move the turrets around. Oftentimes, because these turrets have that gun barrel, mentally we think that's okay, that's the way the vehicle commander is facing, that's the way that the tank's looking, that's the way the enemy is, right? The gun's going to be pointed towards the enemy, so you can change the focus in that direction by having this vehicle push off like this. It's almost like, oh, the weight of the turret kind of swung around when the vehicle got pushed off the side of the road, or I'm not sure. Maybe if you look at your reference pictures, maybe it's more like that, just the way the vehicle turret swings loose. But again, by having that figure in there to draw the viewer's attention, you're going to be able to better control that line of sight that the viewer's going to have as they look around the scene. It's all about what you want to focus on, what story you want to tell. If the destroyed Panzer is not the story you want to tell, then push it off the side of the road and have it half buried in a bush, and don't really, put a whole lot of rusty colors or things that are abnormal that would draw the viewer in. Don't let them see the impact. For all you know, maybe the vehicle just ran out of gas and was abandoned and a bulldozer just pushed it off the road. So if you want the focus to be on the Sherman, then maybe that is when you have the group of infantry soldiers walking by and you have the vehicle commander talking with one of the soldiers, and have that help draw the attention. So you'd have, for example, this is your infantry guy. They're talking back and forth, and the barrel's pointed this direction where you have a bend in the road, and you have a couple infantry guys stacked up like they're scared to go around that corner. And he's saying, "Hey, can you go around that corner?" And they're having this argument because they're both like, "Well, I don't want to be the first one to go." So it's just something like that it doesn't have to be a full story, but the more little hints and things like that you put in there, especially if this was a destroyed Sherman. If you had a Sherman driving down the road with a destroyed Sherman in an intersection, now definitely this guy's not going to want to go around the corner until the infantry, cut through and take out whatever position is in there that just destroyed that vehicle. Big as your imagination is, that's really the only thing stopping you from coming up with more intricate or more compelling stories. Anyway, guys, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Here's a blooper for you. Again, you can do a lot of things. You can move the turret. Guess not. Thought you could. Anyway.